Hello everyone, welcome to the first chapter of Indian economic development, that is Indian economy on the eve of independence. So the objective of studying this chapter is to become familiarized with the status of Indian economy on the day of independence, like what was the status of Indian economy when we got our independence, and understand the factors which led to the underdevelopment and stagnation of Indian economy. So the topics covered under this chapter is the level of economic development under the colonial rule. We'll understand what is the meaning of colonial rule, and we look into the different sectors of Indian economy, like agricultural sector. What was the contribution of agriculture to the Indian GDP at the time of independence, and what was the population dependent on Indian agriculture? And industrial sector, foreign trade, was it concentrated or was it widespread? And demographic condition, like the life expectancy of Indians, and occupational structure, what was the employability under three different sectors of economy, and we will also study about the infrastructure development under colonial rule. So the introduction, the basic purpose of British rule, as you might have studied in your previous classes, especially in history, there was the advent of many European countries. Portuguese was the first, and one among them, or the major among them, was the British. So what was the intention of British advent or invaded into India? So the prime or the major reason of British was to serve their industrial process. We are currently in the 5th industrial revolution. So you might have studied in your previous classes the first industrial revolution, which was started with the invention of steam engine, which led to the mass production or production in the large scale, and it replaced handmade or manual work. So the major or the prime aim of colonial government was to reduce India to a mere supplier of raw materials and importer of finished goods from the industrial revolution which was taking place in the European countries. So first we have to understand what is the meaning of colonialism or the colonial government. The simple meaning of colonialism is that one country ruling over the other country. This is the meaning of colonialism. So the ruling country does not only take the political control, but also it determines the economic policies of the colonized country. So here the colonial government or the colonial country will gain out of the colonized country. The country which is getting ruled by the other country is a colonized country. The country which is ruling over the other country is called as colonizing country. In case of India, colonialism is one of the major reason for underdevelopment of Indian economy. Now let us understand what was the level of Indian economic development under British rule. So India was known for its famous handicrafts. You might have heard about a story about a cloth or a sari which can be folded and kept in a matchbox. So that is called as muslin cloth. It has its origin in Bengal region, the current West Bengal and Bangladesh. So it is also called as Dhakai cloth, and it was a symbol of royal status. And the French traveler Francois Berlier, he said when he visited India, and he wrote in his book, and he said that Bengal was richer than Egypt. Can you imagine? A single state was richer than the country of present world. And he also said that India had its trade relations throughout the world. So according to British economist Angus Madison, he said India's share of world economy was more than the quarter or almost near to the quarter of world's economy. For example, if the whole world is earning 100 rupees, so 25 rupees was earned in India. So in 1700, it was nearly quarter of the world economy, and it was reduced to 14.2% by the year 1913. The major reason for this was the exploitation from the colonial government of the British rule over India, because they mainly promoted or protected their home country's benefits. So they reduced India to the exporter of raw materials, and they dumped all the large scale production because of the industrial revolution to the Indian market, and they forced Indians to buy that. The handmade goods could not compete with the machine made products of the British rule. So the country's growth rate during the first 20th century, that is between 1900 to 1950, was just around, was less than 2%. Let's say a year on year growth. If the country's GDP was 100 rupees in 1900, by the year 1950, it was less than 102 rupees. You can imagine the exploitation of colonial government. And per capita output was only 0.5%, meaning the total income of a country divided by total population, what do we get, was less than 0.5% growth year on year between the first half of the 20th century. So the colonial government or the British government never made a sincere or a serious effort to calculate Indian economy in quantitative terms, like in GDP or per capita income. So there were few individuals who made serious attempts to measure the national income. Dadabhai Moraji was the prime among them. He is also called as Grand Old Man of India. He came up with the drain of wealth theory, which we will discuss later in our classes. And William Digby, a British officer, Finlay Shiraz, Shah and Kambata, V.K. Rao, whose work is considered as significant in calculating national income and also per capita income, and R.C. Desai. These were the few members who made sincere efforts to measure Indian economy. Now you can see the chart in which the year of estimates, in which year they calculated, and according to them what was the national income and per capita income. This is the chart, and these are the persons who made efforts to measure Indian economy or the per capita income of a country. You can see there are serious or huge gap in the calculation because it was never backed by an institution. The individual made the efforts, so it could have some arbitrary assumptions, and an individual cannot cover the entire country. This was the reason for the huge difference between the calculation of national income. So there are three sectors in economy: primary sector, secondary sector and tertiary sector. Primary sector means use and extraction of all the natural resources. For example, agriculture, mining, these will come under primary sector. Secondary sector means conversion of raw materials into finished goods. For example, manufacturing sector, industrial sector, garments, clothing, textiles, all this will come under secondary sector. Tertiary sector includes all types of services. For example, teaching. This is an example of tertiary sector. Doctor services. These are the example of tertiary sector. So, during the time of independence, Indian economy or the Indian workforce was largely dependent on agricultural sector. You can see that 85% of our population was dependent on agriculture. That is why Indian economy is called as agrarian economy, meaning the agriculture sector holds the largest population in its workforce. And there are numerous evidences in which we can see that before the advent of Britishers or the Europeans, Indian agriculture was flourishing, meaning it was at a very good state. It was contributing more to the Indian economy or the GDP. At that time, we did not have such terms to measure national income, but Indian agriculture sector was at good state before the advent of Britishers. So, what was the impact on agriculture in India? So, Britishers introduced new class of landlords called zamindars. You might have read in your history textbooks that Britishers introduced three types of landlord systems. That was zamindari system, mahalwari system, riyotwari system. In that, zamindari system affected more on it had a more negative impact on the Indian agriculture because the land was given as a private property for zamindars. They were held responsible to collect the tax and give it to the British government. So they exploited our farmers and they forced our farmers to grow and pay more taxes. And the land was snatched from the small farmers and taken over by the zamindars. This made our farmers as just the tillers or the tenants of the land. And commercialization of agriculture. Britishers forced Indians to grow cash crops. For example, indigo. There was a system called Teen Katia system against which our Mahatma Gandhi also fought. That means if you have a 20 acre of land, in that 3 acre or 3 by 20th part of your land should be grown only indigo. Indigo means that is used for dye. Your blue jeans, that is used by indigo. Indigo is used to make your jeans blue. So Britishers forced Indians to grow cash crops. This resulted in scarcity of the shortage of food crops and led to the famines, starvation, many things, many more things. You might have read about the famous or infamous Bengal famines, which happened in 19. As much of the agricultural production were sent to the market for sale. Commercialization of agriculture means it has two types. One is growing cash crops, and the second one is growing for the sale, not for the self-consumption. So the new revenue system, especially zamindar system, led to the peasant indebtedness, meaning the peasants were forced to take loan at higher interest rate, and it added burden on the peasants. Peasants are nothing but the farmers. Commercialization of agriculture, they ultimately resulted in mass poverty, starvation, and deaths. Reasons for stagnation of agricultural sector. Under the British rule, Indian agriculture system never grown because they did not invest in any research or development or infrastructure facilities like irrigation systems, construction of dams, nothing. They did nothing for Indian agriculture. They just exploited Indian agriculture for their own country's benefit, not for the Indian development. Land settlement system like zamindar system also exploited. Commercialization of agriculture, lack of irrigation facilities, low level of technology or the outdated technology. There were no modernization of technology in the agriculture. Nowadays you can see tractors or many farm equipments are used for agriculture. At that time, the technology was outdated. Commercialization of agriculture. As I already explained, it has two aspects. One is growing of cash crops and other is growing of for the sale, not for the self-consumption. So it became prominent around 1860. That was the time during which first industrial revolution took place. That is why they made Indian agriculture or converted or forced Indian agriculture to become commercialized agriculture. And many commercial crops like cotton, jute, tea, tobacco, indigo were introduced to meet the demand of factories in the British or the Britain, European countries. Forced commercialization. They forced our farmers to grow only cash crops or the commercial crops which are in demand in Europe, not in India. And this led to the shortage of food crops. This shortage led to the famine, starvation, and deaths of lakhs of innocents of Indians. And cash transaction replaced our old barter system. This also had an impact on Indian agriculture. So you can see the indigo, cotton. So industrial sector. Indian industrial sector or the handicraft sector could not grow or make a sound develop under colonial rule. Why? Because they made India as a near exporter of raw materials and importer of finished goods. Even the country's famous handicraft industries declined. Lack of capital good industry. What is the meaning of capital good? A good which is used to produce another good. For example, machineries. These are the capital good. There was no capital good industry in India because there was no investment from the British government or no interest to develop Indian industrial sector. They just exploited our raw materials, they took it away and they dumped their finished products into India. This process of British government in India is called as deindustrialization policy. Meaning the industry, handicraft industry was well or doing good in India, they reduced it to the lower level or they declined. Indian export volume was made dominant with raw materials directed to Britain, and it imported or export from the Britain to India only the finished goods. This ensured that there was no level of local supply to meet Indian demands for finished goods. If the raw material is taken away from India, how can the local sellers or the manufacturers get the raw material to manufacture what is the demand in India? They could not. That is why it resulted in the low level of local supply.